As we process what it means to lead, the question that I always ask women after asking this question is, what is God calling you to? And this would be my question to the men too, women and men. What is God calling you to? What is He inviting you to?
Hey everybody, this is Nick Nye, and I am here with Deb Gregory, and we are going to talk about something that is really important to both of us to engage in, and that's really talking about women in the church. And so Deb is here, and she has been a part of Veritas since the very beginning, before we even started the church. And so I feel like I've gotten to know her really well. She's gotten to know me very well, and we've gotten to travel to Africa together, and I've gotten to spend a lot of time with her and her husband, and it's been an awesome experience to learn from her. And so I'm really thankful that you get to learn from her as well. So Deb, would you introduce yourself? Tell us who you are, maybe any interesting thing about you, and I'd love to hear even how you grew up.
Okay, sure. I'm Deb Gregory, and I am a mother of two precious, very young daughters. My husband's Jim. He is a bona fide rocket scientist, which keeps us all on our toes at home.
Mm-hmm.
So I
And when
grew
you
up.
say that, you like
Mhm.
he literally is a rocket
Oh
scientist. We
yeah,
got to clarify that. That's
yeah.
his job.
It's his job, and in fact, last week one of his students let me launch a rocket. It
Seriously.
was pretty cool. Yeah. Um, but I grew up in a really conservative, fundamentalist family, the youngest of six kids, four brothers. And I guess we always say we put the fun in fundy. And I don't think my parents would say that, but they were missionaries. I grew up in Japan. So I've been around church stuff my whole life, the good and the bad. I studied theology in college. I am an Old Testament geek.
Mm-hmm.
Love it. And I went to seminary at Gordon Conwell, studied Old Testament archaeology, dropped out, and became a filmmaker.
Deb, you are like the most widely like gifted, and I can't even think of one person I've ever met that has the breadth of skills that you have. I can't think of one person. Just the multiple or just the uniqueness. I don't know if you've made this connection. I'm sure you have, but it seems like it comes from your background of just being a third culture kind of person. You bring a really unique vision to your life now.
Mm,
How do you feel like that has played like a part in your life now and how you think
mm-hmm.
growing up outside of America?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's had a huge impact on me. I think for many years it kept me feeling very apart from the church. I just
Mm,
never felt like I belonged because I was always on the outside. I could see all of the cultural baggage that
mhm,
was waved around as biblical, and yet it wasn't a culture that I was familiar with. It wasn't how I understood the Bible. So I think that gave me a lot of grace for an awareness of the marginalized, people who are on the margins of society, and especially of the church. So that's kind of one of my biggest passions is just,
mhm,
I don't know, I like to stand on the edges and just be a safe space for
mhm,
people who are entering with trepidation or
mhm.
people who are considering leaving or leaving. And yeah, so that is something that I feel God has gifted me with, that awareness and that passion, because of my background.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm really thankful for it.
Mhm.
One of my jobs was a filmmaker. I think you knew this. I worked for a Christian mission agency and denomination at their headquarters, and my job was just to go around the world and capture the stories of what God was doing in churches of every, in just so many different settings, different cultures, different value structures, and to worship
Mm,
with people in this different way, I think has really influenced how I understand God's kingdom
mm-hmm,
and my role in it. So
mm-hmm,
yeah, it's been a lot. As I said, growing up, it took me a long time to feel like I belonged in the church.
mm-hmm,
But at some point, I felt like Jesus just said, "Hey, you belong to me,"
mm-hmm,
and that really helped me get over a lot of that angst and
mm-hmm.
frustration.
Do you see like your just like because of your background and your heart for the marginalized, do you see that as an asset in the church or like your experience just at large or as sort of like a we don't want to go there with you, Deb. Like that's too much. That's your perspective. You're because you're kind of challenging the biblical, as you said, like this sort of biblical mandate we place on things that maybe aren't quite so clear.
Hmm.
And how has that been received generally?
Um, it probably is received not so much on the ideas, but on the way I articulate them.
Hmm.
So I think when I was younger, I was much more critical and angry and frustrated by it. So it probably wasn't heard very well.
Hmm.
But hopefully, I'm at a older place
Hmm.
where I feel a lot more grace for the church itself.
Hmm.
I think Tim Keller and a lot of those New England folks like David Wells and Richard Lentz, I think they do a really great job of trying to help people understand theology as something that we embrace in the context of our culture
Hmm.
and recognizing there's always going to be tension.
Hmm.
But it does. I don't know. I guess I've come to a place where I have a lot more grace for culture,
Hmm.
where I think God works in that more than I used to.
Hmm.
But yet, I hope I can always be challenging
Hmm.
that when culture is saying things that are different from what the scripture says,
Yeah. Yeah.
we have to really pay attention to that.
Right.
So,
Well, one of the things I think that, I mean, the biggest conversation I want to have today that I think has been really challenging for me personally, and I think for Veritas as a church, is that you've brought just a significant voice in helping think through that. I know you've been really influential on me, like just when it comes to like engaging women in the church, as you talk about the marginalized and feeling that struggle. I think a lot of women typically feel marginalized in the church or feel like they don't know where their voice can go or how it should be communicated. And I think a lot of women are asking questions that you have asked, which are just like, what does that look like? What can that look like? What should that look like? Because we see so much come from Jesus and his ministry and his life and his words and his interactions that maybe feel threatening to
mm-hmm.
male authorities, even then, but also now. How do you begin to kind of unpack that whole reality for you?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Well, let me first start out by saying thank you, Nick, for inviting this conversation. I think when you approached me about this, the question you asked was how do we do a better job of raising up women in leadership? And that is that is a question women have been longing to hear for such a long time. So
Mm-hmm.
just by you asking that means a lot to me personally, and I know means just an enormous amount for so many women who have never heard of a pastor even asked this question before.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you. And I have a lot of baggage and I have my
Mm-hmm.
own experience and my own lens. So when I approach this question, I recognize that I can only see it from one perspective,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm happy to share that. But as I've been processing this, I've been challenged to actually ask this question to other women.
Mm.
Say, okay, you know what? What would it look like for you to exercise your gifts of leadership, and what might stand in the way? And the answers that I've heard have been very different from the ones that I would have come up with.
Mm.
So I think
Do you
it's
see
great.
that as like good at like different as in like, oh, I never thought of that, or just you're just kind of hearing other women's experiences and sort of how maybe on a gut level they just felt like defeated or deflated or frustrated that you're hearing that, or has it been like some women aren't processing this, just don't know how to process it? How has that
Yeah,
felt?
probably all of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe it's a reminder that we can't assume we know where a woman's coming from
Mm-hmm.
or what she thinks,
Mm-hmm.
her experience, because it's going to be really different.
Mm-hmm.
We live in an age where we talk about women's issues from so many perspectives and angles and experiences,
Mm-hmm.
and that's going to be the same in the church.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we really want to adequately address this question, I think we have to really listen well.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think some women have answered with a lot of frustration.
Mm.
Others have answered with just like, well, I've never thought of it because
Is it because no one's ever asked?
no one's ever asked, and I've never seen it. I've never seen a woman lead in the
Mm.
church, so I've never really thought about it for myself.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know I was allowed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a broad range, I think,
Mm-hmm.
of maybe perspectives and
Mm-hmm.
experiences.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see people having a lot. But I have a lot of particular questions, but I'd
Uh
love to
huh.
just like pop open a general can
Uh
and
huh.
just say like what about you personally? Like how has this just personally really how have you dealt with that as you've asked other women some of those kinds of big questions? How have you personally wrestled through that?
That's a good question. I tend to be more of a thinker than a feeler.
Mm-hmm.
So I think my first response has been to process it and categorize it like, okay, these women are saying, I'm hearing what women are saying, and this would fall into this category and this issue that I think we can really address. So that's my first level. But I think as I've kind of gone back over my notes and listened again, I think it's made me grieve.
Mm.
I feel emotional about it
Mm-hmm.
on some level. I feel sad,
Mm-hmm.
not just for these women, but for the heart of God.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking this morning for people who use the Pray As You Go app.
Mm.
um, the reading was of Mark today, where Jesus um, was teaching, and his mothers and brothers and sisters came and asked for him. And he said, "Who are my mothers and brothers and sisters? Here they are. Those who do the will of God are my mothers and my brothers, my
Mm.
sisters." And I think that's what I long to see more women understand,
Mm-hmm.
their relationship with Christ, the way they belong to him as mothers, brothers, not as brothers, but as sisters and
Mm-hmm.
and mothers,
Mm-hmm.
um, and belong to one another, belong to the church in this
Mm-hmm.
family sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's kind of what the longing that it's provoked in me, a
Mm-hmm.
longing to see women who understand themselves as made in the image of God,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't think that's as easy for women to accept and understand as men think it is.
Yeah.
So,
Hmm. One of the things that I think I don't quite understand, but am have been processing a lot of is there's kind of been theological camps that we kind of camp out in, with complementarianism or egalitarianism, which are big theological words you can look up
they're
later.
not
But
theological. They're not theological.
But yeah, I mean, but I think but for me, I'm like really wrestling with like, how can you really engage with, the tribe or the camps that, I guess, like, how can you think beyond those? Because a lot of times I
Mhm.
see like, not, I think those labels are sometimes helpful just to give background and perspective and understanding. And, I feel like I fall into more of a complementarian tribe, but I sometimes feel like there needs to be like a complementarian 2.0. I don't know if that makes sense, but like where there just needs to be like a deeper like, okay, this isn't just on paper, but how does this like how do you live out a relationship, a complementary relationship
Mm.
with one another where it's not like fingertips drawing on a chalkboard where it's like, which I think just leaves a lot of bad taste in
Mhm.
your mouth of inequality and those kinds of
Mhm.
things, which are not being pictured in my mind, but
Mhm.
I know have been articulated within that context.
Mhm.
But how do you see just thinking about that 2.0 or just
Mhm.
entertaining that idea of like, okay, what should it look like? What do you see it
Mhm.
look like? Men and women living together in leadership,
Mhm.
particularly. How do you see that
Mhm.
looking in how we engage one another?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, I think this issue would fall under what I would see as a cultural. Um, okay, so I'm a filmmaker.
Mm,
If I've got a camera that I'm using, the mechanisms for processing that picture inside the camera, everything that I need, but I need that lens attached to get my focus, and
mm-hmm,
but I can use many different lenses with a good camera. And so I think that this issue is largely a lens issue, if that makes sense.
mm-hmm,
Of course, it's a theological issue. Of
mm,
course, God cares about this. But the way we're talking about it with these two terms,
mm-hmm,
I, at least how I'm understanding it more and more, is more of a cultural issue. I think it stems out of a philosophical lens that we use
mm,
that hasn't been part of the church lens. I think this is kind of a newer lens that comes maybe out of an existential view
mm,
where relationships
mm-hmm,
came to mean something different
mm,
in that time period,
mm-hmm,
the 19th, 20th, 21st century.
mm-hmm.
For us as humans, as us as Westerners.
Yeah.
So we're talking about issues of relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, first of all, that it's important and helpful, I think, to recognize the cultural baggage that we carry with that.
Yeah. Do you feel like that's hard to discern that?
Oh, yeah,
I
of
feel like it's
course.
really hard.
It's super hard,
Mm-hmm.
especially if this is all we know. I mean, if this is the only lens we've ever had,
Yeah.
that it's almost impossible to pick it apart. I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
really takes somehow getting out of that, taking that lens off for a while,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to get back into that camera without the lens, how the
Yeah.
mechanisms work, what's really going on here.
Mm-hmm.
So I personally am not convinced that this argument is based squarely in scripture the way we think it is.
Mm.
It's a unique argument to the time and place that we live,
Mm-hmm.
but that doesn't mean it's not an important one.
Yeah.
So I think it's worth engaging
Mm-hmm.
with care. And I guess what I read recently, a study by Baylor University, they looked at on campus the egalitarians and complementarians, the
Mm-hmm.
women, and looked at aspiration for their
Mm.
life.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a huge disconnect.
Mm.
And that to me felt so tragic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if we are complementarians, if that's, where the camp that we fall in,
Yeah.
that's really tragic that
Mm-hmm.
that along with this view, there would be women who have less aspiration for their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that translates to a willingness to listen to God's, an ability to really listen to God's calling on their lives.
Mm.
That's probably the discussion I would rather have
Yeah, yeah,
than,
go there because I would love to hear
yes.
that too. Yeah, like what how do you see that? Like how are women feeling? Where do you think are ways that women feel even that they're not able to like kind of hear those aspirations from God?
Yeah. Well, that's probably also a cultural thing. It's
Hmm.
not easy for us in our
Mm-hmm.
day and age to spend time really listening to God.
Mm-hmm.
We're doers, we're actors. We get an idea, we move on it, we think it's the will of God. We build, we
Mm.
construct, we do, we use our gifts, and but we haven't, yeah.
Do you think it's like, is it like
Mm.
I'm probably asking too broad of a question, but I want to learn here. Is it like, cause we just go too fast as a culture where we don't slow down and take time? Or is it like this is, I don't know if this is my, I'm dumping my stuff and thinking through this, but like like for a woman to really have the freedom and the flexibility to stumble, fall, process, and keep moving, and while stumbling, which I feel like I do, and
Hmm.
I feel like I get a lot of space for it, and I get a lot of
Hmm.
freedom to kind of trip, fall, and make a lot of mistakes, and
Hmm.
it's not seen as bad or as flaky or whatever
Right.
as it might for a woman.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah. And let me read a quote that I have from a woman who, when I asked her, what keeps you
Mm-hmm.
from ministry, she says, I wouldn't feel comfortable leading at church unless I knew I would be supported when I fail. Life
Mm.
has taught me that when a woman fails in leadership, the men say, see, we knew it wouldn't work.
Hmm.
If I saw there was more grace, mentorship, and support for women, I'd reconsider.
Mm. So you think that's a challenge for men in a way,
Yeah.
or pastors and in general?
I
Like,
think
how do you want that heard?
um I would love it to actually be heard,
Yeah.
to be received, to be understood. I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of guys would say, "What? We don't do that." But I think it's true
Mm-hmm.
in life, in our society, but it's very true in the church.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's easy. I don't. You tell me, Nick, if you hear a guy who says, I feel this sense of calling to do such and such in the church, and then you heard a woman say the same thing, who would you feel more comfortable discipling and raising up
Mm-hmm.
and pouring into as a guy, as a
Mm-hmm.
pastor?
Yeah, I mean, I'm honestly, yeah, I would just be way more comfortable with a guy. And I
Mm-hmm.
think I've been wrestling with that thought a lot over the last couple years, especially, and and asking, is that like culturally, is it
Mm-hmm.
because it's like kind of unacceptable, like in a weird
Mm-hmm.
way, to like really invest in a woman? Do and sometimes I think maybe insecurely, like, why would a woman want to be invested in by me? Um,
That's a great question. Yeah.
wouldn't it be, I just think, wouldn't it be better for them to be invested in by another woman?
Where's the woman who's going to invest in them?
Yeah,
in,
you,
in
Deb.
church leaders. Yeah.
No, I agree. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a great point in many
Mm-hmm.
ways. And I think that's where I think I honestly have failed as a pastor, is just I've put an expectation on women to handle this shepherding load in many ways that I'm not equipping them
Mm-hmm.
very well as a pastor in my role, spiritual role at the church. Probably out of my own insecurities, and there's this deep fear out there, I think, by male pastors too, of just like sexual immorality
Mm-hmm.
and just so much fear in that, that has been struck in me, of just like, I don't want to cross the line. I really want to be above reproach. I don't want to be accused. I don't even want to, I just don't want any of that. So I therefore will hive off everything. And and I've seen how that extreme thinking has hurt more than it has helped.
Mm.
I don't know. That wasn't really a question, but do you
Yeah.
do you
No, I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thing to grapple with. How do we do this in a healthy way,
mhm,
with the right kinds of boundaries? But yeah, not just out of fear,
mhm,
let women flounder.
mhm. Well, can I throw this out there too?
Mm-hmm.
I I I think, like, as pastors, we're pretty dumb in some ways of just like how to engage, and I think the desire, at least at Veritas, has been to like kind of admit that
Mm-hmm.
and just ask more questions, like, how can we engage better? How do you see, or how, like, just how do you see things moving forward as even challenge me? Or
Mm-hmm.
how do you see more women feel equipped, be equipped, and how do you see a culture of safety for women to fail, even in the same way that men have that safety to fail or to struggle or to explore
Mm-hmm.
their gifts? How do you see that happening?
Um, I think the first is to do what you're doing, and that's by
Mm,
asking the question, and then to really listen.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think if it's okay, I want to just read some of the
Yeah, go for
feedback
it. That'd be
from the
great.
women,
Mm-hmm.
and hopefully that will fuel conversations not just with you and I, but with other people listening,
Mm-hmm.
and empower women to actually ask these questions of
Yeah.
themselves, of God,
Mm-hmm.
and then of in their community groups. I think that's the best way to process this.
Mm-hmm.
And then with pastors, if this is, if they really do feel a calling to leadership,
Mm-hmm.
that to make sure that there's a way for them to come forward with that,
Mm-hmm.
and a discernment process.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to hear some.
Okay, so some of these were a surprise to me. I hadn't thought about,
Mm-hmm.
but I'll just read through. One person said, "I don't know much about my gifts because it's not clear to me what is acceptable to use and what is not within the church. If I knew my gifts or my leadership was welcome, I'd be more compelled to exercise."
Mm.
Another person said, "Oh, I don't see any women in leadership roles, so I can't envision myself using them at church. If I saw some women leading rather than just serving, I might actually think differently about my own leadership potential." There's a lot of discussions that could happen with each one of these.
Mm-hmm.
Another one says, "I usually just see women as backup singers on the worship team. This doesn't give me much confidence that we are able to do more than accessorize and complement what the men do.
Mm.
I wish so badly that there were more women playing instruments and leading in worship." I thought that was a really interesting one,
Mm-hmm.
because I think it provokes two questions. The first question is our worship gendered?
Mm.
Is our style of worship based on the instruments that traditionally and commonly men play?
Mm.
And what would it look like if, I think there's a lot of amazing women musicians in our
Mm-hmm.
church. What would it look like if we used the instruments that they play
Mm-hmm.
in worship and the style that they play and listen to?
Mm.
So that was an interesting question. I think the flip side is also great, especially for you, dad of girls, is
Mm-hmm.
why do we, why not teach our girls to play the electric guitar and
Mm-hmm.
the drums and other things
Mm.
that are traditionally guy?
So you're seeing kind of a couple patterns, like just what I'm, or I guess I'm hearing a couple patterns in that of just like seeing leadership and just
Mm-hmm.
seeing examples and models, which that's that's clearly important for all people to have that, especially women, to be able to see that,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I can do that and I can engage in that way. But also just seeing that there has to be more mentoring,
Mm-hmm.
some model mentoring. There's M words in there, but mentoring, like how do we help women find their gifts, discover who they are, and what, how they can exercise that and lead in that, which I think is really, really valuable. And I think sometimes as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking about even Veritas as a church and how we've really been striving to create more of a space for everyone to not just say, here's the vision of the church, conform to it, but more like, what is God's vision for your life and how can we equip you to do that? Which, when you really unpack that, they're very different philosophies. It's in how power is saw as lived out, and how and really how the work of ministry happens, that it's not programmatic or driven by one ideal or one person or one vision. It's many. And in many ways, the pastors feel like our role is mainly to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. And so we're kind of wanting to see that be a space to have that happen. And I think the modeling part, though, is a huge space that we need to have more conversation about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as we kind of wind down, as we're getting close to the end, I know we have a lot more. We
Mm-hmm.
could talk way more about it. What were you, if you were to just nail it down and just say, here is just the one challenge that you would give to men and to women in this, what would it be?
I think the challenge I would give to men, if they're able to recognize and to hear this,
Mm-hmm.
is I think there's a difference in language that happens between men and women that comes out in even something like the word leadership. It's a
Mm-hmm.
male word.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we say woman leader,
Mm-hmm.
because that's not,
We have to differentiate it from just leader.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, because it's not common. It's not what we think of when we think of leader. We think
Mm-hmm.
of certain traits, certain androcentric traits
Mm-hmm.
um, of leadership. And when women don't have those traits, or if they are not leading in that way, I think there's a real danger for men to make an assumption that women are less mature
Mm-hmm.
emotionally, spiritually, and I don't think they recognize that
Mm-hmm.
this happens. So
Mm-hmm.
my challenge would be for men to really consider that
Mm-hmm.
if women aren't doing and leading and if they're speaking softly, or if they're not, speaking with the authority that men speak with,
Mm-hmm.
or if they are and it's offensive to us,
Mm-hmm.
to really consider the difference of language,
Mm-hmm.
and how that's interpreted, how they understand women,
Mm-hmm.
who speak and function a little differently than men.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make them less capable of leading?
Mm-hmm.
What would it look like for them to lead in their language and in
Mm-hmm.
their feminine style?
Mm.
So I'll leave it at that. We can talk a lot more about that another time.
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can continue to engage in. I think
Mhm.
as we wrap up, because of time, one of the thoughts that I had just engaging in this is I know that like on one hand some might feel really offended by this and just
Mhm.
having this conversation and probably would want to lump maybe you and I or your opinions or my opinions something into a category
Mhm.
into a space where it's like this is going against my tradition or my whatever. Or I think it might really make some angry. Just to, yeah, just there's a lot of anger around this in many on many levels. Feeling defensive about it, and I think also feeling frustrated. Women maybe feeling frustrated, men feeling defensive, those kinds of things. But I think I'd like to end with just challenging us, like something that I've been challenged a lot by you, Deb, and thankful for is just continually taking a posture of humility and realizing I don't know everything. I don't know how to live out some theological reflections that I see in the book of Genesis and Ephesians and so on. I don't know how to quite live out all of those perfectly well. And I think Veritas as a church doesn't either. And I think there's constant conversation, exploring, asking questions, figuring it out. But my hope is that as a church, we can all just take a real deep posture of humility, but keep going, keep having the conversation and keep working through it, but do it again with care and learning to outdo one another and showing honor in that. And because I could easily see the conversation spin out of control as it did when I was in college and angry, at
Yeah.
all kinds of issues. And as I've seen in, even my own upbringing, but wanting to really take a posture of humility in that. And
Mhm.
Deb, I think you have just um, served our church so well by speaking and engaging and questioning and just drawing a depth to how women can be cared for and loved. And so I'm just incredibly thankful for you. And I know other women have said the same thing about you personally. And that's why I really wanted you to be on one of the first episodes that we do in this, because I think you bring something really valuable and important to the conversation. I'm so thank you for that.
Thank you, Nick.
Yeah.
Yeah. If I could just say one more thing for the women and the men out there,
Mm-hmm.
as we talk about leadership, we think about it through the lens of our gifts, and
Mm.
for better for worse. Oh, if I can find this quote, um, Richard Rohr says, "People are destroyed by their gifts and talents. They are destroyed by our. We are destroyed by our gifts because we identify too closely with what we can do well."
Mm.
And as we process what it means to lead, the question that I always ask women after asking this question is, what is God calling you to? And
Mm.
this would be my question to the men too, women and men. What is God calling you to? What is He inviting you to?
Mm.
And it may not be what your gifts are. It may not be your strengths of leadership. It may be, but I think we as a church function so much better when we don't just lead because we have the gift of leadership, but when we lead because God is calling us to something. So that's my invitation to women, invitation to men, invitation to all of us to listen, to ask God, what are you inviting me to do? And how can I do that faithfully for you?
That's so good, Deb. Thanks for being on this podcast.
You're welcome, Nick.
That was such an encouraging time with Deb, and I hope that was enjoyable for you. I want to encourage you to go check out the liner notes in this. We want to make sure that you can see the help that we've gotten from Katie and from Matthew, and I'm so thankful for their help mixing and mastering and organizing and administering this podcast. And if you want to get involved in it, let me know. Just send me an email at veritascolumbus.com. Let me know, or come find me on Sunday, or go talk to one of the lead pastors. They can get us connected. But thanks for listening, and I hope it was edifying for you as it was for me. And encourage other Veritasers to check it out, listen, and tune in. Thanks a lot. See you next time.